Imagine inheriting $50 million in 1873. That sum, adjusted for inflation, equals $1.3 billion today. You could buy entire city blocks, fund private armies, and never touch the principal. Entire dynasties were built on less. And yet, within a single decade, 85% of America's wealthiest families lost that grip on fortune completely. Not through wars or revolutions, but through something far more insidious. The quiet machinery of economic collapse meeting the fatal hubris of men who believed their empires were immortal. This is the story of how American aristocracy devoured itself from within. Chapter 1: The Emperors Who Built Kingdoms on Borrowed Time. By 1870, America's wealthiest 50 families controlled more wealth than the bottom 45% of the nation combined. The mathematics of concentration were staggering. Cornelius Vanderbilt alone commanded $90 million, a fortune so vast it exceeded the annual budget of most state governments. His railroad empire stretched from New York to Chicago, 1,700 miles of steel rail that carried the lifeblood of American commerce. Every ticket sold, every freight car loaded, fed directly into his coffers. He was 76 years old and still expanding. August Belmont's Fifth Avenue mansion contained $2 million worth of European paintings. Not the house itself, just the art hanging on its walls. His estate employed 43 servants whose sole purpose was maintaining the appearance of effortless luxury. The Astor family holdings spanned 14,000 acres of Manhattan real estate, land purchased when the island was still farmland and forests. By 1870, those farms had become the most valuable urban property in the Western Hemisphere. These men had conquered more than business. They had conquered the very concept of limitation. When Vanderbilt wanted a railroad, he built one. When Jay Gould wanted a telegraph network, he purchased Western Union outright. When J.P. Morgan needed to stabilize the gold market, he arranged a private loan to the United States Treasury. The federal government borrowed from him. The balance of power had inverted. Capital commanded nations, not the reverse. They built monuments to permanence. William Backhouse Astor commissioned a mansion that required 2 years just to quarry the marble. The Vanderbilt family planned estates designed to house 10 generations of descendants. These were not homes. They were dynasties made visible, architecture as genealogy. The assumption was implicit in every cornerstone. This wealth would persist because it had always persisted, because it was too large to fail, because the men who built it were too brilliant to be undone. But concentration creates vulnerability. When 50 families control that much wealth, they become dependent on the same systems, the same markets, the same illusions. They all held railroad stocks. They all speculated in Western land. They all borrowed against future growth that seemed infinite. The economy was a ladder they had climbed together, and none of them looked down to see how far the ground had receded. The psychological transformation was complete, and these men no longer saw themselves as participants in an economy. They saw themselves as the economy itself. Vanderbilt once told a reporter that he could buy any senator for $5,000 and any governor for $20,000. He was not boasting. He was stating prices. Power had become a commodity, and they controlled the supply. What they failed to understand was that markets do not distinguish between confidence and delusion. The same mechanisms that built their empires could dismantle them. The same speculation that generated returns could generate catastrophic losses. They had mistaken a rising tide for personal genius, and when the tide turned, it would turn on everyone simultaneously. By 1872, the American economy was a coiled spring. Railroad expansion had consumed $17 billion in investment. Much of it borrowed from European banks at interest rates the railroads could only sustain if growth continued forever. 5,000 banks held deposits backed by railroad bonds that would become worthless if a single major line collapsed. The entire system rested on perpetual expansion into Western territories that were running out of West. The emperors threw parties. They commissioned portraits. They endowed universities with their names. And they never once considered that the ground beneath them was not bedrock, but sand, and that sand was already beginning to shift. Chapter 2. The Southern aristocracy's $4 billion funeral. When Confederate currency became worthless overnight in 1865, it erased an entire civilization's wealth in a single legislative stroke. Before the war, Southern plantation families held $4 billion in slave wealth alone, not land, not cotton. Human beings, cataloged in estate ledgers as assets with depreciation schedules. The average large plantation in South Carolina counted 300 enslaved people, each valued at $1,000. That single line item represented more wealth than most northern industrial fortunes. The Hampton family of Columbia owned 600 people. The math was obscene and precise. $600,000 in human inventory. Then the Confederacy lost. Not gradually, not through negotiated settlement, but through unconditional surrender. And with that surrender came the 13th Amendment. 391 words that vaporized every dollar invested in bondage. It was the largest uncompensated seizure of private property in human history, and it was morally correct and economically apocalyptic for the families who had treated people as collateral. The Lee family of Virginia watched their entire world collapse in layers. First, Arlington House was seized by Union forces. Then it was converted into a military cemetery, a deliberate desecration designed to ensure Robert E. Lee could never return home. 200,000 soldiers would eventually be buried on his family's front lawn. The symbolism was not subtle. The old order was being interred, literally, on the estates of those who had led the rebellion. But the real catastrophe was financial. Southern wealth had always been an illusion built on forced labor. Take away the labor, and the plantations became liabilities. Our rice fields in the Carolinas required intensive cultivation that only made economic sense with unpaid workers. Cotton production in Mississippi depended on scales that free labor could never sustain at competitive prices. Within 2 years, half the plantations in Louisiana had been abandoned. The land had not changed. The crops had not changed. Only the arithmetic of exploitation had been corrected, and the correction bankrupted an entire class. The cultural devastation was total. Families that had held power for 5 generations discovered they could not feed themselves. Charleston society, once the apex of American refinement, saw its grand mansions carved into boarding houses. Savannah's aristocracy sold family heirlooms to northern collectors at pennies on the dollar. The furniture and silver traveled north, while the families traveled nowhere, trapped in cities they no longer controlled, speaking a language of lineage that no longer commanded respect or credit. What the war revealed was that Southern wealth had never been stable wealth. It was entirely dependent on a system that could only survive if the rest of the nation agreed to enforce it. The moment the North withdrew that enforcement, the entire economic model collapsed. There was no pivot, no adaptation. You cannot adapt when your entire fortune rests on an institution that has been abolished. By 1870, the South had become America's first modern example of dynastic erasure. Families that had ruled for a century were working as shopkeepers if they could find shops that would employ them. The plantations they refused to sell eventually went to auction for back taxes. Northern speculators bought entire estates for less than the cost of the mansion chandeliers. The lesson was visible but ignored. Wealth built on unstable foundations will not survive the earthquake. And yet, while Southern aristocracy mourned its slave wealth, Northern industrialists were building their own empires on equally unstable ground: speculation, leverage, and the assumption that railroads would expand forever into a West that was rapidly running out of frontier. The machinery of collapse was already in motion. They simply had not heard the gears beginning to grind. Chapter 3: The Panic That Murdered a Generation of Millionaires. September 18th, 1873, the day Jay Cooke and Company collapsed and took 5,000 American banks with it. Jay Cooke was not a speculator or a con artist. He was the most respected banker in America, the man who had financed the Union victory in the Civil War by selling $600 million in government bonds directly to ordinary citizens. He had made patriotism profitable and saved the Republic in the process. His reputation was unimpeachable, which made his failure all the more catastrophic. Cooke's bank had invested everything in the Northern Pacific Railway, a transcontinental line designed to open the Pacific Northwest to settlement and commerce. The project was sound in theory. The execution was ruinous. Construction costs exploded beyond every projection. European investors, and burned by previous American railroad failures, refused to buy additional bonds. By September, Cooke's bank was insolvent. On the 18th, it closed its doors. The market reacted like a body going into shock. If Jay Cooke could fail, anyone could fail. Every bank, every railroad, every fortune built on credit became suspect. Within hours, depositors were lining up outside banks demanding their money in cash. By the end of the day, the New York Stock Exchange had closed for the first time in its history. It would remain closed for 10 days, a desperate attempt to stop the hemorrhaging. But closing the exchange only delayed the reckoning. When it reopened, the selling was relentless. Railroad stocks lost half their value in the first week. Banks that had loaned against those stocks now faced insolvency themselves. The panic spread from New York to Philadelphia to Chicago, a contagion of fear that moved faster than the railroads that had caused it. Within 2 years, 18,000 businesses had declared bankruptcy. 5,000 banks failed outright, wiping out the savings of millions. Unemployment reached 14% nationally, higher in industrial cities. Factories closed. Railroads stopped construction mid-track, leaving half-built bridges rusting in fields. The entire apparatus of American growth ground to a halt. The millionaires suffered in ways that would have been unthinkable a year earlier. Henry Clews, one of Wall Street's most prominent brokers, lost his entire firm. He had been worth $3 million. By 1874, he was borrowing money for rent. The Drexel family banking house in Philadelphia survived, but only by liquidating nearly all its investments at catastrophic losses. Fortunes that had taken decades to build evaporated in weeks. What made the Panic of 1873 uniquely destructive was its duration. This was not a brief correction followed by recovery. The Depression lasted 6 years, 6 years of deflation, unemployment, and stagnation. Companies that survived did so by slashing wages, which reduced consumer spending, which caused more businesses to fail. The economy spiraled downward in a deflationary loop that classical economics had no tools to combat. For the Gilded Age dynasties, the panic was a revelation they refused to accept. Their wealth was not invincible. Markets could destroy fortunes as efficiently as they created them. And yet, the lesson did not penetrate. Those who survived convinced themselves they had been smarter, more disciplined, better positioned. They did not understand that survival was often luck, not skill. The truly dangerous assumption was that the next panic would be different, that they would see it coming, that their empires were now too established to fail. The ground had shifted beneath them once. It would shift again, but first there would be 2 decades of recovery, of renewed speculation, of even greater hubris. The empires would grow larger, the mansions more extravagant, the confidence more absolute, and when the next collapse came, it would make 1873 look like a rehearsal. Chapter 4: The Second Son's Curse and the Squandered Throne. Cornelius Vanderbilt left 95% of his $90 million fortune to one son, and that decision destroyed his dynasty. William Henry Vanderbilt inherited an empire in 1877. His father's death made him the richest man in America overnight, controlling more liquid wealth than most European monarchs. He was 56 years old, methodical and terrified. For decades, Cornelius had dismissed him as weak, unsuitable for leadership. Now William held the entire dynasty in his hands, and he knew his own sons were even less prepared than he had been. William understood numbers. He doubled the fortune to $194 million in 9 years through careful management and strategic expansion. But he also understood human nature, and what he saw in his children horrified him. Cornelius II was competent but conventional. William K. was charming but careless. Frederick was sickly. George was artistic. None of them possessed the ruthless instinct that had built the original fortune. They had been raised in luxury, educated in Europe, trained for society rather than struggle. They knew how to spend money. They did not know how to protect it. The spending began before William was even buried. Cornelius II commissioned the largest private home in New York City, a 6-story mansion on Fifth Avenue that required 400 workers 2 years to complete. The breakers in Newport cost $7 million to build. A summer cottage used 3 months per year. It contained 70 rooms, gilded ceilings imported from Italy, and a heating system that consumed more coal in a season than most factories used in a year. The house was not designed for living. It was designed for display, a monument to wealth so excessive it became its own justification. William K. Vanderbilt went further. His wife Alva demanded Marble House, a 50-room palace in Newport that cost $11 million, equivalent to $330 million today. The house required 40 full-time servants just to maintain. The ballroom could host 400 guests. The stables were faced with marble. Horses lived in quarters nicer than most American families. Alva had not come from old money, and she spent new money with the fervor of someone determined to prove her arrival. But the real hemorrhaging was invisible. The mansions were fixed costs. The true drain was the lifestyle they represented. Each estate required staff, maintenance, property taxes, and constant renovation to match the escalating standards of Gilded Age excess. The Vanderbilts were not spending income. They were spending capital, liquidating railroad stocks and industrial holdings to fund consumption that generated no return. Each dollar spent was a dollar that could never compound again. George Vanderbilt represented the final evolution of dynastic decay. He built Biltmore Estate in North Carolina, a 250-room chateau that required $6 million and 6 years to construct. It was the largest private home in American history, a monument to aristocratic ambition on a continent that had no aristocracy. The estate employed hundreds. It generated nothing. George filled it with art and books, creating a cultivated sanctuary that existed purely for his own aesthetic satisfaction. It was magnificent and ruinous, beauty subsidized by capital erosion. The mathematics were inevitable. William Henry Vanderbilt's $194 million fortune was divided among his children. Each heir received roughly $30 million, already a dilution. Then those heirs divided their shares among their children. By the third generation, individual inheritances were measured in single millions, substantial but no longer dynastic. And each generation spent faster than the last, confusing the monument for the foundation, mistaking inheritance for achievement. What William Henry understood but could not prevent was the second son's curse. The man who builds the fortune possesses skills the fortune cannot teach. He knows scarcity, risk, failure. His children know only abundance. They see the empire as permanent because it has always existed in their lifetime. They spend freely because they have never known constraint. And their children, the third generation, inherit expectations without the resources to sustain them. They are aristocrats by training, but middle class by math, a displacement that destroys identity and fortune simultaneously. The Vanderbilt dynasty lasted 3 generations from apex to irrelevance. Cornelius built it in 60 years. His grandchildren dismantled it in 40. The mansions stand today as museums, monuments not to success, but to the impossibility of transferring hunger across generations. You cannot inherit the instinct that created wealth. You can only inherit the wealth itself, and wealth without instinct is wealth on a timer, counting down to the day the last heir realizes the money is gone and they possess no skills to replenish it. But Chapter 5. The wives who burned through kingdoms for a curtsy. Alva Vanderbilt spent $3 million on a single costume ball to prove she belonged in a society that still despised her. March 26, 1883. The Vanderbilt costume ball became the most expensive single night in American social history. Alva had spent months planning, obsessing over every detail, determined to force Caroline Astor to acknowledge her existence. The Astors represented old money, and old money had rules. New money, no matter how vast, was not automatically admitted. Alva intended to buy her way through the gates or burn them down trying. 1,200 guests received invitations. Each was instructed to wear historically accurate costumes, costing no less than $1,000. Alva herself appeared as a Venetian princess, dripping in jewels worth $500,000 borrowed for the evening. Her husband's costume, a suit of gold-plated armor, weighed 40 pounds. The ballroom was transformed into a French chateau, complete with artificial forests and a fountain that dispensed champagne. The menu included 60 courses. The entertainment featured 2 orchestras and a private performance by the Metropolitan Opera. The cost was staggering: $3 million for a single night, equivalent to $90 million today. That sum could have built 3 hospitals or endowed a university. Instead, it evaporated into floral arrangements and caviar, and the temporary satisfaction of watching Caroline Astor walk through Alva's front door, an acknowledgement that new money had finally purchased legitimacy. But legitimacy proved expensive to maintain. The costume ball was only the beginning. Alva's daughter, Consuelo, became the ultimate transaction, a human bridge between American wealth and European aristocracy. The Duke of Marlborough needed $9 million to save his ancestral estate. Alva needed a title for her bloodline. The negotiation was conducted like a corporate merger, with lawyers drafting settlement agreements that specified exactly how much money would transfer and when. Consuelo was 18 years old. She was in love with someone else. None of that mattered. On November 6, 1895, she married the Duke in a ceremony that cost $200,000. The $9 million dowry transferred immediately, rescuing Blenheim Palace from ruin. Consuelo got a title and a husband she despised. The marriage lasted 11 years before collapsing into separation, then divorce, then the quiet erasure of a transaction that had benefited everyone except the woman at its center. This was the great status war of the Gilded Age, fought by wives wielding their husbands' fortunes as weapons. Mamie Stuyvesant Fish hosted dinners where guests were given live monkeys as party favors. Caroline Astor's annual ball set the social calendar for an entire city, an invitation conferring legitimacy that money alone could not buy. These women understood that wealth without social position was wealth without meaning, at least within the closed system of their world. So they spent millions pursuing curtsy and title and the approval of people who would never fully accept them. The spending was pathological. Mrs. Stuyvesant Fish once commissioned a dinner where each female guest received a black pearl as a place setting. The cost exceeded $30,000 for a single meal. Another hostess spent $50,000 on floral arrangements for a garden party that lasted 3 hours. The flowers were thrown away that evening. The money was simply gone, converted into temporary beauty and the memory of excess. What drove this madness was not greed, but insecurity. These women had married into wealth, but they had not been born into legitimacy. They were one generation removed from the source, close enough to smell the factory smoke their husbands' fathers had created. They knew, at some level, that their position was conditional, that old money looked down on them, that their fortunes were industrial rather than inherited. So they spent with the fury of people trying to outrun their origins, converting dollars into social capital at exchange rates that made no economic sense. The paradox was that their spending accelerated the very decline they feared. Every million spent on parties was a million not invested in the businesses that generated the wealth. The railroads and steel mills that funded the excess required constant reinvestment to stay competitive. Instead, capital was being extracted and burned for social advantage, a transfer of resources from productive assets to consumptive display. By 1900, the great families had spent themselves into a corner. They had the mansions, the titles, the social position. They also had estates that required fortunes to maintain and declining industrial holdings that could no longer sustain the lifestyle. The wives had won the status war, but the victory was Pyrrhic. They had conquered society just as society was becoming irrelevant, a closed game played by fewer and fewer people with less and less to spend. The curtsy they had purchased so dearly was a curtsy from a dying world, acknowledgement from an aristocracy that would not survive another generation. Chapter 6. The Day America Declared War on Inherited Wealth. February 3, 1913. The 16th Amendment passed, and the government gained the power to tax income for the first time in peacetime. The amendment contained 165 words. Its impact was seismic. For the first time in American history, outside of wartime, The federal government could tax individual income directly without apportionment by state population. The old protections were gone. Wealth was now vulnerable to majority rule, and the majority had decided that concentrated fortunes threatened democracy itself. The groundwork had been building for decades. The Panic of 1893 had revealed the same structural instability as 1873, only worse. 500 banks failed. 15,000 businesses collapsed. Unemployment reached 20% in industrial cities. Farms foreclosed across the Midwest. And through it all, the robber barons seemed immune, their fortunes growing even as the nation starved. The contrast was too stark to ignore. Teddy Roosevelt had begun the assault with trust busting, using the Sherman Antitrust Act to dismantle monopolies that had grown too powerful. Standard Oil was broken into 34 separate companies. Northern Securities was dissolved. The message was clear. No company, no fortune, no dynasty was beyond government reach. But breaking up monopolies only addressed corporate power. The fortunes themselves remained intact, passed from father to son without taxation, accumulating across generations into aristocratic concentrations that mocked the democratic experiment. The progressive movement demanded correction. If America was to remain a republic, it could not tolerate hereditary wealth on European scales. The income tax was framed as a weapon of equality, a way to fund government without relying on tariffs that fell hardest on the poor. But everyone understood the real target. The tax would hit the top 1% with rates that climbed as income rose, a direct assault on dynastic accumulation. The initial rates were modest, 7% on income over $500,000, less than $1 million today. The wealthy barely noticed, but the precedent was catastrophic for their long-term interests. Once the government possessed the power to tax income, it possessed the power to tax it at any rate a future majority might demand. And majorities are fickle, especially when the gap between rich and poor becomes a chasm. World War I provided the excuse for escalation. By 1918, the top marginal rate had reached 77%. Fortunes that had compounded untaxed for generations now faced confiscation of 3/4 of their annual growth. The mathematics of dynastic wealth depend on compound returns. Remove 3/4 of the return, and the compounding slows to a crawl. Add in inflation, estate taxes upon death, and the costs of maintaining the lifestyle, and the dynasty begins to hollow out from within. The Gilded Age families fought back through every available channel. They hired armies of lawyers to find loopholes. They created trusts designed to shelter assets across generations. They moved money into tax-exempt municipal bonds, sacrificing returns for protection. But the fundamental equation had changed. The government was now a partner in every fortune, a silent claimant on every dollar earned, and that partnership was not negotiable. What the income tax revealed was a philosophical truth about American wealth. It was never meant to be permanent. The same democratic instincts that prevented European-style aristocracy from taking root in the colonies now prevented it in the industrial age. Wealth could be built, but it could not be protected indefinitely against the will of the majority. The social contract required circulation, the constant churning of fortunes to prevent the calcification of class. The estates began their decline in slow motion. First, the growth stopped. Then, the erosion began. Property taxes, income taxes, estate taxes, each one nibbling at the edges. The families tried to adapt, converting mansions into museums to gain tax exemptions, donating art collections to avoid estate duties. But these were defensive maneuvers. strategic retreats designed to preserve fragments of dynasties that were already collapsing. By 1929, the top 1% still controlled enormous wealth, but the trajectory had reversed. They were no longer accumulating faster than the economy. They were liquidating to pay taxes, selling assets to maintain lifestyles, watching their share of national wealth slowly contract. The income tax had done what no panic or depression could accomplish. It had placed a ceiling on dynastic growth, a mathematical limit beyond which fortunes could not expand without triggering confiscatory taxation. The war on inherited wealth was not a revolution. It was an amendment, a procedural change that altered the fundamental mathematics of empire building. And unlike panics or crashes, it was permanent. Markets recover. Tax codes, once established, only grow more aggressive. The families had lost more than money. They had lost the legal framework that made dynasties possible. What came next would simply be arithmetic, the patient work of compound taxation, consuming compound returns until nothing remained but names and empty mansions. Chapter 37: The Crash That Ate 80% of Rockefeller's Fortune. October 29th, 1929. The day $14 billion of stock value evaporated in 6 hours of trading. The morning began with panic already in motion. October 24th, Black Thursday, had seen 13 million shares traded in a selling frenzy that briefly stabilized only when a consortium of bankers pooled $240 million to buy stocks and restore confidence. The stabilization lasted 4 days. On Monday the 28th, the selling resumed. 3 million shares, 6 million, in 9 million. By Tuesday morning, everyone understood that the Thursday rescue had been a delusion. The banks could not stop this. No one could. Trading opened at 10. Within 30 minutes, the ticker tape machines were running 2.5 hours behind the actual market. Brokers were selling stocks at prices they could not see, executing orders based on bids that had already expired. The entire apparatus of modern finance was moving too fast for its own infrastructure. The machines could not keep pace with the collapse. By noon, $14 billion in market value had simply vanished. Not transferred, not hidden, not moved to different assets. Vanished. Stocks that had traded at $300 were now worth $30. Companies with real factories and real revenues were being priced as if they would never earn another dollar. The panic was not rational, but rationality had left the building hours ago. All that remained was the animal instinct to escape, to sell everything before it became worthless, to convert paper wealth into cash before the paper stopped representing anything at all. John D. Rockefeller watched 80% of his fortune evaporate in a single day. He was 90 years old, the richest man in American history, and the stock market had just declared that most of his wealth had been imaginary. His Standard Oil shares, carefully accumulated over 50 years, had lost $400 million in value by the closing bell. He still had hundreds of millions remaining, but the psychological impact was total. If Rockefeller was vulnerable, everyone was vulnerable. The Woolworth family fortune halved overnight. Frank Woolworth had built an empire of 5 and dime stores, retail locations where working families bought necessities. The business was sound. The stores were full. None of that mattered. Woolworth stock collapsed along with everything else, dragged down by margin calls and forced liquidations that had nothing to do with the actual health of the company. The Guggenheims hemorrhaged millions daily. Their copper empire was real, tangible, producing metal the world still needed. But copper prices collapsed as construction stopped, and their stock holdings imploded as the market decided that nothing had value, that every company was overpriced, that the entire boom had been a shared delusion from which everyone was now waking simultaneously. What made the crash uniquely destructive was the leverage. Millions of Americans had bought stocks on margin, putting down 10% cash and borrowing 90% from brokers. When the stocks fell, the brokers issued margin calls demanding more cash. When investors could not pay, the brokers sold the stocks into a falling market, driving prices lower, triggering more margin calls. The death spiral was mechanical, unstoppable, a mathematical certainty once the initial panic began. Fortunes built over lifetimes vanished in days. Men who had been millionaires on Friday were bankrupt by Monday. Suicides followed. Investors jumped from office windows. And brokers who had spent years advising clients found themselves unable to explain what had happened, because what had happened defied explanation. Markets were supposed to price assets rationally. This was not rational. This was collective hysteria made manifest in ticker tape. The crash destroyed more than money. It destroyed the fundamental assumption that had powered the Gilded Age for 60 years, that wealth, once acquired, was stable, that fortunes could be built and passed to children and grandchildren, that the system itself was trustworthy. October 29th revealed the truth. Wealth was conditional, temporary, dependent on the continued belief of strangers. And when that belief collapsed, the wealth collapsed with it, instantly and totally. By November, the Gilded Age dynasties were in freefall. The Vanderbilts, the Astors, the Belmonts, all of them watched their stock portfolios implode. The mansions still stood, but they were now liabilities rather than assets. Who could afford to buy a 50-room palace in the middle of a depression? Who could afford to maintain one? The families were trapped in monuments to a prosperity that no longer existed, curators of their own irrelevance. The crash was not the end. It was the beginning of the end, the opening act of a depression that would last a decade and complete the work of destroying American aristocracy. But on October 29, 1929, the verdict was already clear. The fortunes were gone. The dynasties were finished. All that remained was the slow, grinding arithmetic of liquidation and decline. Chapter 8. The mansions they couldn't sell and the taxes they couldn't pay. By 1935, Fifth Avenue's grandest palaces were selling for 10 cents on the dollar, and still finding no buyers. The William Vanderbilt mansion occupied an entire city block between 5th and Madison. It had cost $3 million to build in 1881, a castle transplanted from Europe and reconstructed in Manhattan with 650 rooms, bronze doors weighing 2 tons each, and a dining hall that seated 200. By 1935, it was functionally worthless. The Vanderbilt heirs put it on the market for $600,000, 1/5 of construction cost. No one bought it. Who needed 650 rooms in the middle of the Great Depression? In 1939, they demolished it. Wrecking crews spent months reducing 50 years of opulence to rubble. The bronze doors were sold for scrap. The marble was hauled to New Jersey landfills. The paintings and furniture were auctioned at fractions of their purchase price. The entire structure, built to last centuries, survived barely 60 years. Where the mansion had stood, developers built an apartment building, subdividing the block into units small enough that middle-class families could afford them. The pattern repeated across Manhattan. The Cornelius Vanderbilt, the second mansion on 5th Avenue and 57th Street, the largest private home in New York City, demolished in 1927. Replaced by the Bergdorf Goodman department store, the Astor Mansion at 34th Street, torn down to build the Waldorf Astoria Hotel. The family literally converted their ancestral home into a commercial property because operating a hotel was more profitable than maintaining a residence no one could afford to live in. Newport faced the same reckoning. The summer cottages that had cost millions to build were bleeding money. The breakers required 40 servants for seasonal occupancy, full-time staff to maintain the grounds, coal deliveries measured in tons, property taxes that climbed every year as local governments, desperate for revenue during the Depression, squeezed the only families left with visible assets. The Vanderbilts discovered they owned monuments they could not afford to keep and could not afford to abandon. Marble House, Alva Vanderbilt's 50-room temple to excess, sat empty for years after her death in 1933, and the maintenance costs exceeded any conceivable rental income. The house had been designed for display, not functionality. It was too large, too expensive, too specific to the needs of a vanished era. The Vanderbilt descendants eventually donated it to the Preservation Society of Newport County in 1963, a tax write-off to escape the burden of ownership. The collapse extended beyond individual mansions. Entire estates were carved apart and sold piecemeal. The Vanderbilt lands in the Berkshires were subdivided and auctioned. The Astor properties in the Hudson Valley became schools and museums. The Belmont estates on Long Island were converted into country clubs, membership organizations where the middle class could play golf on grounds that had once hosted the richest families in America. The aristocracy had become a tourist attraction, their former domains accessible to anyone with $20 and a weekend. What the families discovered was that physical monuments to wealth are only valuable when someone can afford to maintain them. A mansion is not an investment. It is an obligation. It requires heating in winter, repairs after storms, staff to prevent decay, taxes that compound annually. During boom times, these costs are trivial compared to the fortunes flowing in from railroads and steel. During depressions, they become unbearable drains on capital that is no longer replenishing itself. The psychological impact was profound. These families had built palaces designed to proclaim permanence, to announce that their wealth was eternal, their position unassailable. The demolitions announced the opposite. Nothing was permanent. Wealth was temporary. The monuments they had erected to immortalize their names became rubble, forgotten before the families themselves were forgotten. By 1940, the great estates were almost entirely gone from Manhattan. Fifth Avenue, once a residential street of unprecedented opulence, had become commercial. Department stores, hotels, office buildings. The aristocracy had been priced out of its own neighborhood, unable to compete with businesses that could generate actual revenue from the same land. The families that remained lived in apartments, reduced from castles to 12 rooms, a humiliation disguised as downsizing. The mansions that survived did so by becoming something else: museums, universities, hotels. They were repurposed, converted from private luxury to public utility. The Frick collection occupied what had been Henry Clay Frick's home, now open to anyone willing to pay admission. Biltmore Estate in North Carolina became a tourist destination. George Vanderbilt's monument to aristocratic fantasy, now funding itself through ticket sales and gift shop revenue. The houses outlived their owners, but only by abandoning the purpose for which they were built. The irony was total. The families had constructed these estates to establish permanence, to create physical proof that their dynasties would endure. Instead, The estates became evidence of impermanence, demonstrations that even the most monumental architecture cannot outlast the economics that created it. The palaces stood as tombs, beautiful and empty, monuments not to success, but to the delusion that success could be made permanent through sufficiently expensive construction. Chapter 9. The heirs who inherited tombs instead of kingdoms. Cornelius Vanderbilt IV died in 1974 with just $5,000 to his name, the last penny of a $90 million inheritance. The fourth Cornelius was born in 1900, the great-great-grandson of the Commodore, heir to a name that had once been synonymous with American capitalism itself. He grew up in mansions, educated at Yale, trained for a life of leisure and significance. What he inherited instead was expectation without resources, a title without a kingdom, the slow realization that the fortune was already gone by the time it reached him. He tried journalism. He tried writing. He tried trading on the family name, converting Vanderbilt into a brand that might still carry value even without the underlying wealth. None of it worked. The name that had once opened every door in America now opened nothing but memories. He died in a small apartment in Connecticut, surrounded by photographs of estates his family no longer owned, attended by no one. The obituary was brief. The Vanderbilt dynasty ended not with drama, but with a whimper, a man dying alone with $5,000 and a name that meant nothing anymore. Gloria Vanderbilt understood earlier than most that survival required adaptation. She was born in 1924, heiress to a trust fund that had already been depleted by previous generations. She watched her mother burn through money trying to maintain appearances, throwing parties the family could not afford, living in hotels on credit that could not be sustained. Gloria saw the end coming and pivoted. She became a fashion designer, converting the Vanderbilt name into a commercial brand. It worked, but only by abandoning everything the name had once represented. She was an heiress who had to work, an aristocrat turned entrepreneur because aristocracy no longer paid. The Astor descendants followed similar trajectories. The family that had once owned 14,000 acres of Manhattan real estate fragmented into branches that owned nothing. By the 1970s, Astor heirs were selling family heirlooms at auction. Silver services that had been wedding gifts from European royalty went to collectors. Paintings that had hung in Fifth Avenue mansions were sold to museums. The liquidation was total and humiliating, the physical dismemberment of a dynasty that had believed itself eternal. The Belmont family watched their racing empire evaporate. August Belmont had made the Belmont Stakes synonymous with American horse racing, a social event that rivaled the Kentucky Derby. His descendants inherited the prestige but not the fortune to sustain it. The Belmont Park racetrack, once family property, was sold to New York State. The Belmont name remained attached to the race, but the family no longer controlled it, no longer profited from it. They had become historical footnotes to their own legacy. What these heirs inherited was worse than poverty. They inherited the memory of wealth, the expectation of privilege, without the resources to sustain either. They were raised to believe they were special, untrained in manners and culture that assumed they would never need to work, educated in schools that prepared them for lives of leisure and philanthropy. Then the money ran out, and they discovered they possessed no marketable skills, no experience with labor, no understanding of how to survive without the cushion of inherited wealth. The psychological devastation was complete. These were people whose identities had been constructed around their family names, who had spent their lives being introduced as Vanderbilts and Astors and Belmonts, who had believed that the name itself carried value. When the money vanished, they discovered the name meant nothing. It was an artifact of a dead era, a reference to history that no one under 50 remembered or cared about. They were ghosts haunting their own lives, present but irrelevant. As some adapted, they took jobs, started businesses, converted aristocratic educations into actual careers. But the adaptation required abandoning the central premise of their upbringing, that they were different, special, exempt from the ordinary struggles of ordinary people. The adaptation was a kind of death, the murder of an identity built on the assumption of permanence. Others never adapted. They lived on the fumes of reputation, trading on family connections that grew weaker with each passing year, borrowing against expectations that could no longer be met. They became charity cases within their own social circles, embarrassments to friends who still had money, reminders that even the greatest fortunes were temporary. By the 1980s, the great Gilded Age dynasties had been reduced to genealogical curiosities. Historians studied them. Tourists visited their former estates. But the families themselves were gone, dispersed into the general population, their fortunes dissolved, their names surviving only as labels on museums and horse races and buildings they no longer owned. The heirs had inherited tombs instead of kingdoms, monuments instead of empires, and the monuments stood longer than the families who had built them. The final generation learned what their great-grandfathers had refused to accept. Wealth is always temporary, always conditional, always vulnerable to forces beyond individual control. The Commodore had built an empire believing it would last forever. 4 generations later, it was gone. He dissolved into apartments and auctioned furniture and obituaries that mentioned the family name, but could no longer explain why anyone should care. Chapter 10. The National Bureau's Verdict on American Royalty. A study tracking wealth from 1850 to 1940 found a survival rate so low it defied every assumption about dynasty building. The National Bureau of Economic Research published its findings in 1946, a comprehensive analysis of wealth persistence across 90 years of American capitalism. The numbers were devastating. 85% of families in the top 0.1% in 1850 were no longer in the top 1% by 1860. Not descended into poverty, but no longer among the absolute elite. Statistically indistinguishable from the merely prosperous. The study tracked 17,000 families across 3 generations, examining estate records, tax returns, and probate documents. What emerged was a pattern of systematic erosion. First-generation wealth, built through industrial achievement or fortunate speculation, rarely survived intact to the 3rd generation. Even successful second-generation inheritors saw their children squander the inheritance or divide it into irrelevance. The American aristocratic experiment had failed completely. The survival rate was even worse at the absolute peak. Among the top 50 families of 1870, only 3 maintained top 100 status by 1940. 3 out of 50. The Rockefellers, through ruthless financial discipline and strategic philanthropy that converted wealth into institutions. The Mellons, who avoided conspicuous consumption and kept their fortune invested in industrial holdings rather than extracting it for lifestyle. The DuPonts, whose corporate structure made individual spending almost impossible. What killed the others? The study identified 3 primary causes, each reinforcing the others. Economic volatility destroyed fortunes faster than they could be rebuilt. The panics of 1873 and 1893, followed by the crash of 1929, each operated as massive filters, eliminating families whose wealth was concentrated in vulnerable assets. Railroads, stocks, speculative land holdings all proved catastrophically fragile during downturns. Progressive taxation accelerated the decline. The income tax, introduced in 1913, combined with rising estate taxes, it created a mathematical ceiling on dynastic accumulation. Even families that survived economic crises discovered that 70% marginal tax rates made wealth preservation nearly impossible. The compounding that had built fortunes could not function when 3/4 of returns were confiscated annually. But the study identified a third factor, less tangible but equally destructive: generational decay in financial discipline. First-generation wealth creators were almost universally frugal, paranoid about loss, obsessive about reinvestment. They had known poverty and feared its return. Their children, raised in comfort, retained some caution, but lacked the visceral terror of destitution. The third generation, having never known anything but wealth, spent freely, assumed the money would last forever, and discovered too late that fortunes require active defense or they vanish. The comparison to European aristocracy was striking. Old money in England, France, and Germany showed much higher survival rates. 80% of British ducal families in 1700 were still landed and titled in 1900. Why the difference? European wealth was built on land, agriculture, and legal structures that protected inheritance. Primogeniture kept estates intact. Titles provided social capital that could not be taxed or seized. The wealth was less liquid but more durable. American wealth was built on commerce, speculation, and industrial expansion. It was liquid, mobile, vulnerable to market forces. It generated higher returns but offered no protection during downturns. An American law, reflecting democratic values, refused to grant special status to inherited wealth. There was no American House of Lords, no legal framework to preserve dynasties. The Republic had been designed to prevent exactly the kind of hereditary concentration the Gilded Age families attempted to create. The study's conclusion was unambiguous. American capitalism is structurally hostile to dynasty formation. The very mechanisms that allow rapid wealth creation, liquid capital markets, entrepreneurial freedom, minimal regulation, make wealth preservation across generations nearly impossible. The system is optimized for churning, for constant creative destruction, for the replacement of old fortunes with new. Dynastic stability requires legal protections and economic structures that America specifically rejected. The Gilded Age families had attempted to build European-style aristocracies in a republic designed to prevent them. The system tolerated their wealth for a generation, extracted most of it through taxation and crashes, and replaced them with new fortunes built on new industries. By 1940, the railroad barons were gone, replaced by automobile manufacturers and media moguls who would themselves be replaced by tech entrepreneurs and hedge fund managers. The throne was always open. The crown was always temporary. No one kept it for long. Chapter 11. The three forces that murdered Gilded Age dynasties: economic panic, progressive taxation, and generational decay. The triple guillotine that beheaded America's aristocratic experiment. The first blade fell in 1873. Yet Jay Cook's collapse triggered a 6-year depression that destroyed 5,000 banks and 18,000 businesses. The families who survived were those whose wealth was diversified, whose fortunes were not concentrated in railroad bonds or Western land speculation. The Vanderbilts survived because Cornelius had built a transportation empire with real revenue, actual trains moving actual freight. Speculators whose wealth existed only on paper vanished overnight. The second blade fell in 1893. The panic began with railroad failures, spreading to banks, then to the broader economy. Unemployment reached 20%. Gold reserves fell below $100 million, threatening the entire monetary system. J.P. Morgan assembled a private bailout, loaning gold to the government, but only after extracting concessions that enriched him personally. The crisis revealed that private financiers had more power than elected officials, a revelation that fueled populist rage and set the stage for progressive reform. The third blade fell in 1913 with the 16th Amendment. The income tax was moderate initially, but World War I provided the excuse for escalation. By 1918, top marginal rates reached 77%. Estate taxes followed, creating a second point of confiscation at death. The families tried to adapt, creating trusts and foundations to shelter assets. But the fundamental equation had changed. The government was now a permanent partner in every fortune, claiming the majority share of all future growth. The Great Depression of 1929 was not a separate force, but the convergence of all three. The crash was an economic panic magnified by leverage and speculation. The recovery was strangled by high tax rates that discouraged investment and limited capital formation. And the families who might have weathered the storm had already been weakened by 3 generations of decline, their fortunes eroded by mansions that generated no return, and heirs who confused inheritance with immortality. But economic forces alone do not explain the totality of collapse. The human element was equally destructive. Cornelius Vanderbilt was a genius of his era, a man who understood ships and rails and ruthless competition. He built his fortune through obsessive focus and willingness to destroy competitors. His children were raised in luxury, trained in social graces, educated in Europe. They knew how to spend money elegantly, but not how to defend it brutally. And their children, the third generation, inherited nothing but expectations and the belief that wealth was a birthright rather than a daily battle. The failure to teach financial discipline was systemic across all the dynasties. The Astors raised children who believed real estate was infinite. The Belmonts raised children who thought art collecting was an investment strategy. The Vanderbilts raised children who built 50-room summer cottages. Each generation mistook the monument for the foundation, spending capital as if it were infinite, never understanding that even the largest fortune can be exhausted through sufficiently sustained consumption. The mathematics were brutal. A $90 million fortune I invested conservatively might generate 5% annual returns, $4.5 million per year. A lifestyle requiring $10 million annually would require liquidating principal. Run that calculation for 20 years, and the fortune is half gone. Run it for 40 years, accounting for inflation and periodic market crashes, and the fortune is gone. The families never ran these calculations. They simply spent, assuming the baseline would always replenish itself, discovering only when too late that wealth is a reservoir, not a spring, and reservoirs run dry. The Gilded Age dynasties fell because they faced pressures from every direction simultaneously. Markets that destroyed concentrated fortunes, tax policies designed to prevent dynastic accumulation, cultural environments that encourage conspicuous consumption, an internal decay that replaced financial discipline with aristocratic pretension. Any one of these forces might have been survivable. All three together were fatal. What makes the collapse historically significant is not that it happened, but how completely it happened. Other eras have seen the replacement of old elites with new. The merchant princes of Renaissance Italy gave way to banking families, who gave way to industrial magnates. But those transitions took centuries. The Gilded Age aristocracy rose and fell in 60 years, a span short enough that grandchildren watch their families ascend from poverty and descend back toward it within a single human lifetime. The American experiment had proven that democracy and dynasty were incompatible. Wealth could be built, but it could not be preserved indefinitely against the leveling instincts of a majority that refused to grant special status to inheritance. The Republic had tolerated extreme concentration for a generation, then corrected it through taxation and economic cycles that operated as filters, constantly removing families from the top and replacing them with new fortunes built on new industries. The system was designed to churn. The Gilded Age families had mistaken temporary dominance for permanent position, assuming they had conquered the system, when in fact they had only ridden a wave that was always going to break. The three forces that destroyed them, economic volatility, progressive taxation, and generational decay, were not aberrations. They were features of the system, mechanisms that ensured no elite could calcify into permanence, that American capitalism would always eat its own children and give birth to new ones. Chapter 12. The Palaces That Outlived Their Kings. Today, you can tour the Vanderbilt mansions for $20, walking through rooms that once required invitations worth more than most Americans earned in a year. The Breakers stands on the cliffs of Newport, precisely as it stood in 1895, when Cornelius Vanderbilt II completed construction. The same Italian marble covers the floors. The same gilt plaster adorns the ceilings. The same ocean views stretch to the horizon. What has changed is ownership. The Preservation Society of Rhode Island operates it as a museum now, are charging admission to tourists who photograph the excess with smartphones worth more computing power than existed on the entire planet when the mansion was built. The tour takes 90 minutes. Guides explain the heating system that required trainloads of coal, the 40 servants who maintain the house, the 3-month season for which this 50-room palace existed. Visitors take selfies in the ballroom where Alva Vanderbilt once hosted 400 guests at parties that cost more than working families earned in lifetimes. The irony is perfect. The masses who were excluded from these rooms now pay $20 for access, while the Vanderbilts no longer have invitations to offer. Marble House sits a mile down Bellevue Avenue, equally intact, equally empty. Alva spent $11 million creating a monument to her arrival in society. The society is gone. The monument remains, maintained by ticket revenue and an endowment established when the family finally surrendered ownership. The house has become what Alva always feared, a museum to someone else's money, a display of excess that tourists marvel at not with envy, but with bewilderment. How could anyone spend this much on a summer house? The question hangs in every room. Biltmore Estate in North Carolina is the most commercially successful of the surviving palaces. George Vanderbilt's 250-room chateau now operates as a full resort, complete with hotels, restaurants, a winery that generates actual revenue. The estate employs thousands. It contributes millions to the local economy. It has achieved something the Vanderbilts never managed: self-sufficiency. The house finally pays for itself, but only by becoming the opposite of what George intended. He wanted a private sanctuary for art and contemplation. His descendants converted it into a tourist destination where visitors pay $85 to tour the house and sample wines produced in vineyards George would not have recognized. These mansions are monuments to a failed experiment. The families built them believing wealth was permanent, that sufficient stone and marble could render a dynasty immortal. Instead, the stone outlasted the wealth. The mansions stand while the fortunes have vanished, physical evidence that no amount of construction can make temporary prosperity permanent. The lesson is philosophical as much as financial. In America, there is no old money. There is only new money that has not yet realized it is already dying. The Vanderbilts believed they had built empires. They had built sand castles at high tide, magnificent and doomed. The tide came in, the empires dissolved. What remains are the castles, hollow and purposeless, serving as museums to the very hubris that destroyed the families who built them. The democratic experiment succeeded precisely because dynastic ambitions failed. American capitalism is designed to churn, to replace old fortunes with new, to prevent the calcification of inherited power. The Gilded Age families attempted to break that design, to establish aristocracies that could survive indefinitely through sheer accumulation. The system destroyed them methodically, using economic panics to erase over-leveraged fortunes, in progressive taxation to prevent accumulation, and generational time to erode the discipline required to maintain wealth. What the mansions reveal is that wealth leaves only monuments, and monuments outlive their purpose. The Breakers was built to house a dynasty. Now it houses memories of a dynasty. The transformation is complete. The families become folklore. The houses become attractions. And the tourists who walk through those rooms learn the same lesson the heirs learned too late. Permanence is an illusion. Wealth is conditional. And even the most monumental architecture cannot make temporary prosperity eternal. The greatest irony is that the mansions serve a purpose now that they never served for the families who built them. They educate. They preserve history. They generate revenue that supports local economies. In death, they became more useful than they were in life. As private palaces, they were absurdities, monuments to waste. As public museums, they teach millions about the dangers of excess, the mathematics of decline, the inevitability of democratic correction. The Gilded Age ended not with revolution, but with arithmetic, patient and implacable. The fortunes accumulated, the families spent, the government taxed, the markets crashed, and when the music stopped, there were no chairs left for American aristocracy. They had spent themselves into irrelevance, built monuments they could not maintain, raised children who could not preserve what they inherited. The experiment lasted 3 generations, peak to collapse, a duration short enough to fit comfortably in a single human memory. Today, the mansions stand as warnings disguised as tourist attractions. Come see how the richest families in American history spent their fortunes. Come walk through rooms that bankrupted dynasties. Come learn that no amount of marble can make wealth permanent, that consumption always exceeds even the largest reserve, that the game is rigged for accumulation but never for succession. The palaces outlived their kings. That was never the plan, but perhaps it was always the only possible ending.